The worst intelligence failure in American history looked like this: the KGB paid, Ames stayed silent, and agents died. This was not a metaphor. It was a cold, mathematical reality that emerged, document by document, during the mid and late 1980s. In those years, the American intelligence system developed more than just a leak, it developed a precise internal source of lethal information. Every time a bureaucrat in Washington used the word failure, someone in Moscow was already being led to a basement for execution. That connection was no coincidence. It was the result of decisions made far from Red Square, in offices that smelled of stale paper, burnt coffee, and institutional certainty. Spring of 1985. The Washington metropolitan area moved through its familiar federal rhythm: secured parking lots, ID badges on lanyards, and office buildings full of people whose security clearances mattered more than their faces. In this world, Aldrich Hazen Ames did not look like a spy. He looked like an absence. He was not memorable. He was not charismatic. He was the kind of man a bureaucracy quietly absorbs and eventually stops noticing. He had spent his entire adult life inside the Central Intelligence Agency. He entered in the early 1960s, completed his training, and built a career focused on Soviet operations. His advancement was incremental, unremarkable, but steady. To a personnel officer, his file showed longevity. To an investigator reading it years later, that same file looked like a map of a disaster: repeated disciplinary concerns, documented alcohol abuse, and what supervisors described as inconsistent reliability. These observations existed on paper. But paper records behavior, it does not enforce judgment. By the early 1980s, Ames had accumulated what counterintelligence professionals later called a dangerous concentration of access. He didn't just read reports, he understood the plumbing of the system. He knew which sources were most valuable, which were fragile, and which intelligence gaps the agency was most desperate to fill. He had visibility into Moscow station reporting, asset identities, and communication schedules. This was not abstract data. This was operational life support. Outside the secure facilities, his life was falling apart. Debt, a messy divorce, and deep-seated resentment were piling up. Ames didn't see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as an overlooked man, underpaid by a system that depended on his labor but refused to reward his presence. In April of 1985, that internal calculation became action. There was no prolonged recruitment. No ideological grooming. No coercion. Ames simply walked into the Soviet diplomatic compound in Washington and offered to cooperate. It was a transaction. Names in exchange for money. The simplicity is the most disturbing part. It required no pressure, only opportunity. Large sums of cash began to flow. His official salary could not explain the influx, yet the system absorbed the discrepancy. Financial audits existed on paper, but in practice, they were infrequent and culturally discouraged when applied to senior officers. The agency trusted its symbols, the tenure, the clearance, the background. Evidence mattered less than institutional comfort. Late summer, 1985. Moscow. Valery Martynov woke before dawn. He had learned, through years of living a double life, that sleep was a liability. He dressed in the dark. No sudden movements. The apartment was quiet in the way only Soviet apartments were, heavy and listening. He did not know he had already been sold. The arrest did not begin with violence. There was a knock. Firm. Official. The kind of knock that only comes from authority. When the door opened, there were no questions. There was only foreknowledge. Someone had spoken. By the time Martynov was placed in the vehicle, his handlers in Washington were still unaware that the connection had been severed. Cables went unanswered. Signals faded into silence. Analysts marked the absence as a delay. Then a loss. Martinov would never be recovered. He was the first surgical incision. More would follow. Sergei Motorin. Adolf Tokachev. High-value assets whose intelligence shaped American military policy. Their executions were the direct result of the information Ames provided for cash. Inside CIA headquarters, life continued. Ames attended briefings where the consequences of his own actions were discussed in the abstract. He recognized the names of the dead. He didn't feel guilt, he felt procedural detachment. He had completed his part of the deal. The rest was just noise. He even passed his polygraph examinations. The polygraph is not a lie detector, it is a tool of psychology. Ames stayed calm. He stayed unremarkable. And the institution, desperate to believe in its own security, accepted his performance. But by the early 1990s, the damage was too great to ignore. Analytical reviews began to focus on patterns. When investigators overlaid compromised operations with personnel access records, the conclusion was unavoidable. Operations Ames knew about failed. Operations kept away from him survived. February 21, 1994. Fairfax County, Virginia. Shortly after 10 in the morning, FBI surveillance watched a silver Jaguar reverse from the driveway of the Ames residence. Vehicles blocked the route. Agents approached. Ames did not resist. There was no chase. The conclusion of the most damaging betrayal in the history of the agency occurred without spectacle. Searches of his home turned up everything: classified documents, notes on Soviet contacts, and records of payments. Ames confessed. His motive was not politics. It was not a grand vision of the world. It was money. The damage assessment was catastrophic. Dozens of operations destroyed. Assets executed. A decade of intelligence wiped out. Reforms followed. Financial monitoring was tightened. Cultural assumptions were challenged. But reforms cannot bring back the dead. The story of Aldrich Ames does not end with justice restored. It ends with a recognition that the most dangerous failures are often the most ordinary. That trust without verification is not a virtue, it is blindness. The KGB paid, Ames stayed silent, and agents died. Not because the enemy was brilliant, but because the system refused to look inward until the evidence became impossible to ignore.